This is Fred Miller, a civil engineer who works for the Air Force. He wanted to buy a house in Virginia, but not just any house. He wanted a big property that would fit his large extended family because they were always planning big get-togethers. It was just part of their routine. Birthdays, cookouts, you name it. Whenever there was something to celebrate, they will be there. There, right down Riceville Road, was this large Gothic-style home that fit the profile. It had enough room to fit everyone in a massive yard to play in. They wanted it. They bought it, but they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. This gorgeous property held a dark past, and they were about to find out soon enough. Fred's sister, Karen, saw that the house was up for sale and immediately called Fred.
I said, oh my goodness, we have to get this house. I called Fred. Fred, this house is for sale. He's like, what house? I said, you know the house, the scary house, I call it.
The fact that she called it a scary house is a clear sign that DNA has memory. The soul remembers. Fred and the Miller family don't even realize it, but they are breaking a bunch of generational curses and making their ancestors proud. This is Sharswood. Fred bought the house in 2020. There's a room with its original furnishings from the 1800s, well kept and in excellent condition. The house came with 10.5 acres of land. The Thompsons, a white family, owned the property since 1917. Fred placed an offer a little over the $220,000 asking price, but he had no idea that he would be landing on a gold mine, so to speak. The second Karen set foot inside, she became obsessed with the place. She started researching it online and later even found a cool hiding spot where people used to hide their valuables during the Civil War.
A hiding spot.
Oh,
They say it was from the Civil War, so they would hide the valuables.
a secret hideaway.
Yes, secret hiding.
Crimes against civilians like robbery, murder, and razing of homes, towns, and property were very common during the war. Rarely anyone would come out of it unscathed. Still, it is interesting to see just how innovative people can be. After digging through records, Karen found something that literally left her speechless. The house was built around 1850 and had stuff even before that. In the 1800s, this place used to be a tobacco plantation, one of the biggest in Pittsylvania County. There were 2,000 acres of land. It was owned by two brothers, Nathaniel Crenshaw Miller and Charles Edwin Miller. But where there is a plantation, there are always slaves. The 1860 census listed not 10 or 20, but 58 enslaved people. All of them were held in bondage. The truth is, the original main house was constructed before 1800, but after 1820, it was divided into a duplex and transformed into slave quarters. According to archaeologists, the former slave quarters on Fred Miller's property are some of the best kept buildings they've seen. It was first put together in the late 1700s with handmade nails and used as a house for a white family. These buildings that were once so common are now super hard to find. When you look at these quarters, you can see two different worlds. The front, bold and beautiful, comfortable and pleasing. The other, straight out of a horror movie. This plantation was constructed for slave owners, an uncle, and a nephew who shared their family name. It was called the Miller Plantation. Fred never heard about that. The Miller family was intrigued. They wanted to know more, so they involved a couple of people and did a thorough genealogical research. What they found shook them to their very core. Their own family were actual descendants of the enslaved people who worked on that exact same plantation. Now, this entire property belongs to them, even the slave house. What used to be a place where their ancestors would never get the chance to enjoy unless it was to serve, be beaten, or violated, now this family lives, owns, and communes in the same house.
I touched the tree, I hugged the tree, and I said, oh my God, you was here when my ancestor was here. I wonder which ancestor of mine touched the tree. I didn't know what to say or do. I just hugged the tree and felt like I'm home.
It is absolutely mind-blowing. This was both sad and interesting at the same time. In the 1850s, the big mansion was designed by Alexander Jackson Davis, a relatively famous architect from New York. In the 1840s and 50s, Davis was the top architect in America for building country houses. He designed more than 100 villas and cottages, mainly in Gothic Revival and Italianate. Many of his important projects, including Gothic villas, were located along the Hudson River. The Sharswood Mansion was built in the Carpenter Gothic style. The house has a steep roof, tall chimney stacks, fancy barge boards, a porch with octagonal columns and patterns, and windows with diamond-shaped panes and covers. Of course, for this place to work, it would need to house plenty of slaves. This particular plantation had 12 other buildings, some of which were used as slave quarters. When Miller and his family tried to put the pieces together of their origins, they realized that finding out their heritage was harder than it looked. Records of black people were incredibly hard to find, especially before 1865. Back then, enslaved people were only listed as numbers. Slavers didn't care to write down their name or anything else. The Miller family did, however, find a picture of Sarah Miller and her death certificate. She was their great-grandmother, the matriarch of the family. It proved that she was born in 1868 in Pittsylvania County, just 3 years after the war ended. She was the first one of their long line of ancestors to be born free. They also found another living relative, Marianne Keyes. Miss Keyes knew Sarah. She called her a force to be reckoned with. Still, everyone loved her. When Keyes was growing up, she didn't talk about slavery with her parents. She knew this was something that people wanted to forget. It was more like an unspoken rule. Children didn't ask any questions. And even if they did, they would be met with, "Don't meddle in grown-up business." That was it. The first time that people started discussing slavery and became more open about it was when the movie Roots came out. Even though the truth has been out there for years, it is typical for people to dodge issues and be silent about them instead of debating them, because this would lead to conflicts, and no one wants more conflicts. Well, the Millers didn't plan on leaving the history of this house in the dust. Something had to be done. With the help of a local genealogist and historian, Carice Luck Bremer, the Miller family was able to track down even more of their ancestors, Violet and David Miller. Their names were finally listed in the 1870 census after the war ended. It also had the names of their children, including Sarah Miller. Then the historian used the Virginia Slave Birth Index to find more information. She found Sarah's older brother, Samuel, as well as their parents. These records are full proof that Miller's ancestors, Violet and David, were actually enslaved at the Sharswood Plantation, the place that Fred now owns. This is where it all started. So, what happened? What was life really like for the black families who lived there? Let's take a deep dive, shall we? In 1860, Pittsylvania County had one of the biggest enslaved populations in the state, more than 14,000 slaves. A decade later, in 1870, it had one of the largest populations of African Americans in Virginia, more than 16,000. English, Welsh, Irish, German, Scots, and African Americans lived here, almost all of them farmers. Even though American Indians inhabited the area for centuries, by the time the Europeans conquered the place, there were barely any left standing. During the American Revolution, this county helped provide supplies and soldiers. The town of Pattonsburg doesn't exist anymore, but when it did, it was one of the 9 major Virginia supply depots. During the Civil War, almost 50% of the county's population was black. Many of them were still in bondage. It was a dark time, worse than you could possibly imagine. Enslaved people lived here their whole lives. They worked here, and some were even buried here. Tobacco was a finicky crop. It required a huge workforce, people who knew exactly what they were doing, and a sizable acreage. Tobacco, along with tomatoes and potatoes, was one of the most important crops to be cultivated all across the American soil. If the plantation was yours, you would, without a doubt, be a filthy rich man or a woman. But as a black person, you wouldn't be so lucky. The slave empire created a system where every black man, woman, and child would be beaten and sold like cattle. A field hand was expected to work from daylight to dark, typically 10 or more hours a day, 6 days a week. They could only take the Sabbath off. They planted, cultivated, and harvested tobacco. When it was time to plant or harvest, slave owners required their slaves to work in the field for 15 or 16 hours a day. If the slaves didn't have to care for the crops, then they would clear the fields, take care of the livestock, cut wood, clean the house, cook a meal, and repair the fences or buildings. There was always work to be done, with little to look forward to. Kind of like a broken factory system that bleeds its workers dry. When slaves were supposed to bring food to the main house at Sharswood, they would walk across the basement stairs. You can see the wear and tear of these stairs due to the sheer amount of people that were using them. It is these stairs that create the perfect picture of what life used to be like for the black families who lived here.
As I walk through this house, a lot of times I'll go down into the basement. I know that when the slaves brought food into the main house, they came up through the basement stairs. And there's a distinct wear on the basement stairs from the years and years of traffic of people walking up those stairs. And I'm thinking, wow, these are my people.
The reason why white people needed so much tobacco was for two things. Tobacco was used as a drug, for recreational smoking, but also as a currency to buy more slaves. It was a staple commodity. The more slaves you got, the easier it was to pay tithes and local taxes, purchase manufactured goods, and so on. But did you know that tobacco was also used for a lot of different things? It was used as a poultice, the moist substance that people applied to the skin to relieve pain and inflammation. It was also an ingredient for making insecticides, the perfect concoction for killing pests and ticks on sheep. Tobacco stems were also a fertilizer. As you can see, quite a versatile product. In the mid-1700s, industrialization was a thing. The rise of machines made tobacco manufacturing all the more lucrative. But it was on the backs of black enslaved people that the tobacco industry grew so much and so fast. The Millers' ancestors lived in the slave shacks behind the main house, with no electricity or indoor plumbing. They were always short on basic necessities, but had to make it work. The white family who ran the farm lived in luxury. To keep control of their slaves, they would do the unthinkable. They would force their slaves to work all day under the hot sun and exploit them however they wanted. There were many cases recorded throughout history where plantation owners, their sons, friends, and brothers would regularly rape slave girls, both young and old. Many babies were born and sold for hard cash as a result of these. Yes, white fathers would sell their own babies into a life of slavery. This was a common practice before the Civil War. For a black person living during this time, life expectancy was low. Food, shelter, and clothing were minimal. You would get beaten and whipped for just about anything, like being disrespectful, producing not enough crops, or having an attitude. If you had a family, you would constantly feel devastated having to see your love and children beaten, violated, and sold at slave auctions. In many cases, families were broken apart never to be seen again. Female slaves had no rights whatsoever, and life for most of them was a living hell. Just look at Thomas Jefferson. He was a rich plantation owner who was at 44 years old when he violated a 14-year-old Sally Hemings. She gave birth to 6 of his children. A slave plantation like Sharswood Tobacco Plantation was a business. It was designed to make money for the owner. The slaves were seen quite like modern farmers see their tractors or other pieces of equipment. If these slaves were sick or broken in some way, it would cost less to have them sold than to fix them. If the 6 slaves were skilled and young, then they would be taken care of. But if they were seen as incompetent and frail, then the plantation would have no use for them. Since the Millers lived right across a massive tobacco field, it is more than likely that every single slave who worked there, whether they were young or old, physically impaired or healthy, was put to work. Children as young as 3 to 4 were required to tend to the crops. Most of them did stuff like picking up trash, weeding fields, helping around the kitchen, and carrying water from the well. If the plantation had livestock, like chickens and cows, then the little children would have to feed the chickens and lead the cows to pasture, collect wood chips for fuel, and so on. By the time they reached 7 and 12, boys and girls were doing heavy work in the field. If the slaves were old and frail, then they had to make clothes by spinning cotton and weaving cloth. Very rarely were slaves treated as decent human beings. Most of the time they were punished and forced to do hard work. Well, there was one thing that was sort of a light at the end of the tunnel. The death rates were much lower compared to those working on sugar plantations. Though they still remained high, farming tobacco required a smaller number of slaves, was easier to work with, and could still bring in a decent income. If you were born in this period, would you treat these people with more respect and dignity? We see these questions a lot. If you were white and had this plantation all to yourself, how would you treat the people working on it? Would you be the same as everyone else? What would happen if you were to go against the norm? In the 1800s, it was not common for a white person to have moral problems with slavery. They were born on top of it, and most slave states made it very hard to free your slaves. They were property to be bought and sold rather than to be freed. If you were a white person, then you wouldn't want to leave your children and partner poor and destitute. You would want to make as much money as you could. Otherwise, you would condemn them to a life of poverty. To succeed as a white man or woman, you had to rely on slavery. There was this idea of widespread superiority and inferiority. Black people were seen as inferior, second-grade citizens. It was a common mentality, part of the nation's fabric. There were 2 factors that allowed white people to overwhelm African Americans and American Indians. First was superior military power. The The second was the desire to conquer. These advantages had nothing to do with skin color, but everything to do with the sheer will to subjugate and dominate. The concept of white superiority spread fast and created a system that would oppress and steal from anyone who was non-white and dared to come to the New World. Education, religion, economy, and politics played a big role in all of that. If you as a white person wanted to make a change and free these slaves when the system was at its peak, then that would have come with serious economic consequences. Slaves, especially those that lived at Sharswood Plantation, were a major portion of their white master's wealth. The only white people who didn't have to rely on slave income were those who got into a respectable trade, like working as a lawyer or a doctor in a big city. So if you had a mindset like that, you wouldn't just be a threat to the nation, but a threat to your family. Kind of like an outcast. It would be much easier for you to find ways to justify your superiority than to fight for what is right. Even to this day, a lot of people in the Deep South believe that the Civil War was not about slavery, but about economics. That's because after the war, the system was still designed in a way to keep former slaves in this endless circle of debt and constant poverty. In the decades that followed, tobacco production in Pennsylvania County was at an all-time high. In 1840, it made over 6 billion pounds of tobacco in excess every year, more than any other place in Virginia. That's why it stayed the #1 crop to farm during that period. And even to this day, people see the tobacco from Pennsylvania County as one of the best in the world. As you may already know, the Confederates bombed Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861. Before the attack on that fort, most people in Pennsylvania County didn't want to leave the Union. But when President Lincoln called for state militias after the attack, many in the county changed their minds and left the Union. This led to Pennsylvania County playing a big role in the Confederate side during the Civil War. In the end, many people died, many of whom were black. More than 3,300 Pennsylvania young boys and grown men served in the Army. Almost 80% were at the front line. And you know, the front line are always sacrificial lambs waiting to be slaughtered. It was a door of no return. Out of those enlisted, 25% lost their lives in service, and 75% either got captured, caught a deadly disease, or were killed. Either way, barely any of them got to see their family again. Then, there was something else that the Miller family found at their property that literally broke them: the cemetery, the place where all their ancestors were buried. No headstone, no names, nothing.
Poking up through the leaves all around us were pointed rocks, some small, some medium-sized. No names, no engraving, just plain anonymous markers of many, many lives.
Just pieces of stone poking through the leaves like they were nobody. Many graves where slaves have been buried have no markers. There is often a mix of unmarked and marked graves that extend into a slope of land, usually hiding a dark past beneath. Most of these names have been lost to time. This is sad and all too common. By the time Fred bought the house, this forgotten cemetery had become overgrown and lost among unchecked vegetation. You could pass right by it and never know it was there. But the Millers are planning to fix it. They want to give their ancestors a proper burial, a final resting place that they deserve. They want to put the pieces back together and memorialize this place so that those who've been disrespected and dishonored through time can finally rest. We don't know for sure what happened to all of the Millers' ancestors. They would have to dig up the graves and have experts study the remains to get answers. What we do know is that the Millers found many unmarked graves in their backyard. Some were marked with big pointy rocks, others had smaller or medium-sized rocks. Fred Miller could only assume that the smaller rocks were used to mark the graves of very young children, possibly even teenagers. But then again, this is just speculation.
It's changed me. It's definitely changed me.
You ever angry?
I get a little bit upset sometimes when I find out things that I should have known already.
Angry at yourself?
At myself and at the system, because I think that we should have known more.
What about the school system?
Should have known more.
So, the status of slaves. What was it like after the Civil War? After the Civil War ended, but before the 13th Amendment was made official, the situation for former slaves varied depending on where they lived and worked. Congress passed the amendment in January of 1865, but didn't ratify it until December of that same year. During that time, slaves thought that they were destined for freedom. But in reality, how free they actually were depended on whether they were born slaves or relied on their landowner. Those in Confederate states, freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, had more freedom than those in Union states that still allowed slavery.
Black men from 10 of the former Confederate states are given the right to vote. And they voted more than 1,500 Black officials move into positions of public leadership.
Legally, all former slaves were still considered property, and the rest were given their formal freedom. What we mean by formal freedom is that white people couldn't just drop the whole owning African Americans immediately. They had to consider the expenses that went into buying a slave and maintaining their property, which was basically the cornerstone of the Southern economy. So even though slavery was technically illegal, some masters in the South still kept former slaves enslaved, especially where news of emancipation had been kept secret. Even after the 13th Amendment was ratified, radical Republicans in Congress had to take steps to stop Southern lawmakers from creating laws known as Black Codes that forced Black people to live a life similar to slavery. So even if slavery was abolished, it took a very, very long time for Black Americans to get their rights and achieve true freedom. And what became of the tobacco industry? Well, tobacco's place in society changed after the Civil War. The prices fluctuated from 1866 to the early 1870s. Tobacco that was ready to use was sold by the pound, while tobacco leaves were sold in batches of 500 pounds. The price of both types depended on their quality or grade. Tobacco brought from the South had to pay massive taxes, anywhere from 5 to 35 cents per pound. This brought many small tobacco businesses to the brink of destruction. Some tobacconists were furious. They thought this was the government's way to try and control people. Despite this, the tobacco industry managed to recover after the Civil War and continued to trade with both local and foreign markets. But then everything changed by the end of 1866, just 2 years before Sarah Miller was born. Serious economic restrictions plagued the U.S. In early 1867, tobacco investors, employees, and stockholders were all at the mercy of the waning demand. Those who were working in tobacco factories ended up with lower salaries. Shortage of capital investments paired with high taxes forced many tobacco manufacturers to increase their prices. Other expenses also ate into the profits of struggling tobacco sellers. Packaging and marketing the tobacco require a lot of money, and some had to consider taking out high-interest loans just to get by. By 1867, these problems forced some tobacco sellers in the South to shut down their businesses. Many once successful sellers were on the verge of going bankrupt. Since Pittsylvania County is located in the South, it is more than likely that the Sharswood plantation faced a similar problem, if not more. The fortune of every tobacco manufacturer changed a lot because of the Civil War. Those that survived experienced different levels of success after 1867, but this wasn't the end. In the 1870s, the tobacco industry in the South started to recover and expand. It slowly grew into a strong modern economic force. Here is a fun fact. The Civil War, even though at first it looked like it destroyed the tobacco industry, it actually boosted production in the late 1870s. The reason was simple. It introduced more soldiers both from the Confederate and Union armies to the weed. Chewing tobacco wasn't popular anymore, especially in social groups. But hand-rolled cigarettes became all the rage since they were seen as more masculine. So yes, business was booming in the Sharswood residence before and after the Civil War. Life for the white landowners was comfortable to say the least, but the Black servants and workers never had it easy. After emancipation, 10 Black people who were former slaves had nowhere else to go, so they signed labor contracts with Nathaniel Miller to keep working as sharecroppers. In 1917, another white family came into the picture, the Thompson family. They bought the property and owned it for more than a century. Fred, along with the rest of the Miller family, plans on restoring the slave quarters and educating people about the history of slavery. Even though he lives in California, the initial plan was to use this new house for family gatherings, but it turned out into a heart-wrenching story. After learning the whole story and nothing but the truth, Fred and his entire family decided it was time to make something different, something that would make their ancestors proud. The Millers founded the Sharswood Foundation, a non-profit organization. They are raising funds to restore both the cemetery and the slave cabin and preserve as much of the plantation's history as possible. Here's what Fred said about his great-great-grandmother Sarah. "I just hope that somehow she's looking down from heaven and finally cracking a beautiful smile." In June 2022, just 2 years after Fred bought the house, the Miller family hosted Juneteenth at the mansion. It was so popular that more than 1,000 people came to visit. They held it a second time in 2023. They gave a tour of the house and shared their story with everyone who wanted to learn more. They've come a full circle. 200 years ago, and no one would have thought that the Miller family would turn this plantation into a place that would commemorate the end of slavery. This event brought the community together. It helps share awareness and teach future generations what opportunities like these would mean to people. This is the kind of experience that can help make a difference. It can educate people of all ages, regardless of race.
Do you think you might allow historians to come and
Absolutely. Absolutely. This place will be open to anyone who wants to learn.
anyone?
Anyone can come here.
It's impossible to think of a better way to celebrate Juneteenth than to visit Sharswood Mansion. It is truly a satisfying sense of justice just because the Millers now own it. And because their story got so much news coverage, they were able to bring a positive influence on education. In this case, the Thompsons inherited their property and sold it to the Millers. Today, despite the depressing history this place has, it does have sentimental value to both the Millers and the rest of the community. But there is a difference between what these properties were and what the Millers use them as today. This is a house, unfortunately, once owned by very hateful people whose racism was ingrained in their minds since they were very little. These plantations were very much self-sustaining economic entities. Young black slaves were the backbone of its success. They were doing heavy labor and lived in terrible conditions. Today, we see a different story. This is fate. For this family to buy the house that their ancestors were once slaves, what are the odds of that? If they keep doing what they are doing and research more about their names, they can include them in their family history. This is something many descendants of slaves do not have, even to this day. It would be incredibly heartwarming if they could find out more about their past and do whatever it takes to preserve it. What is truly remarkable about this story is that now this family is getting together for every possible gathering. Whether it is a birthday party or any other celebration, they are always there for each other. It is the exact opposite of what their ancestors had to go through, and this in itself makes it a chance of a lifetime, a miracle. Most plantations began as small operations where landowners would work alongside their slaves. They would borrow money for equipment and seeds and rely on the support of their family. But once business was booming, slaves proved critical. Landowners no longer had to work. Generations and generations of black people would do all the work for them, no matter how terrible it might have been. These plantations, especially before the Civil War, were like a prison, where hundreds of thousands of black people were subjected to horrific abuse. As a nation, we shouldn't hide our past, whether it's good or bad, morbid or indifferent. Nothing should be swept under the rug. Every story needs to be told so that we can see how Americans have overcome every obstacle along the way, how they battled racism and cruelty, and what that means for the families who lost their lives to achieve true freedom. This is resilience. This is perseverance. Yes, humans can be cruel, but they can also be inspiring. In the face of all that hardship, everyone who was suppressed found a way to live. They did their best for their family, and history helps us see that. Where we come from, there is always a possibility to make a change. Miller's story is truly one to remember. It deserves all the attention it can get. After all, history must be preserved. Hopefully the Sharswood Foundation will achieve all its milestones and fix every inch of the slave quarters, including the cemetery. What do you guys think? Do you have a descendant that has a story to tell? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As always, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.